Roxy.
You know Miss Bailey?
I know Roxy Bailey, if that's the one you're talking about.
No, this is Miss. You know Miss Bailey's first name? I can't remember her name. I always called her Miss Bailey.
And she was in Boston.
She was in
the
Boston
South End.
On Columbus Avenue.
In the South End, right?
And Holyoke.
Yeah, near Holyoke.
I still say it was Roxy Bailey.
This woman might have been well into her 70s back at that
It
time.
was not
Yeah.
Roxy.
She and her husband had been a Pullman porter, and they owned a large house with maybe 6 or 7 rental rooms. But in addition to getting a rental room, what you got is advice from Miss Bailey. Like, I was coming in one night at 2 o'clock, and Miss Bailey said, "Woo, 2 o'clock and tomorrow's a work day. Is that the way you live?" Kind of thing. And she was a gateway for people coming up from the South. There was one young man who was caught gambling in the alley behind her house. She had found that he was a decent person. And the cops made a sweep and picked him up. And I happened to be in her kitchen when she was talking to Judge Admore, this municipal judge, about this boy. And he was saying, "Well, Lana, if you catch him doing wrong, you got to take him in."
You got her name too.
Yeah, the lady.
Lena or Lina. Lina, yeah.
Yeah, you just said
Lena.
the name.
Lina, I think.
Lana Bailey, yeah.
Lana Bailey, I don't know her.
And she was talking to the judge that she used to work for as a maid. And she said, "Now, Judge Admore, I was in your house one night and there must have been $10,000 on the card table. And didn't nobody take you in, and they didn't take those other men in either. Now this boy is from a good family and he made a mistake, but he's got a good job, and I think, you know, that's who she was." And she would let people know that she thought this was not a good behavior, a good practice, and that her house was a respectable home. I don't know how many people she might have helped, but she helped a lot of them. And there were other people like Miss Bailey, like Edna James. People got in trouble. You know Edna?
Yes, I know.
Everybody
Yeah.
do Edna.
And those are the kind of folk I worked with. They had struggled oftentimes as domestic servants, so forth, to get a house, which they then struggled to keep up. But it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was really a home, and they provided guidance. So you can imagine how I felt when it became increasingly apparent that they had targeted a lot of these folk to get out. Or like Mr. Green, who was a cook and worked on the Cape. He could take boys in the summer and teach them how to be waiters and cooks and so forth, and he did that. Well, anyway, I was thinking about those things, and I said, one of the things we have to do is tell the story of what the practice was like and how race might have informed some of it. How did established theory inform the things that I did? Prior history of race matters, I say here. We have enabled and enhanced functioning to promote individual and group interests. And then question would be, how does mass incorporation of young black men impact the family and the community? That would be something that Ted would have thought about a good bit. And his strategies were different. I remember when on Sunday morning I'd be stretched out looking at the New York Times and the Boston Globe. We lived side by side. Our houses were like, not a house, but his room was there and mine was right there. But then we'd hear, boom, Ted coming down to cook his breakfast. It was a can of corned beef hash, and the way he knew it was cooked was when he would smell it burning.
Sometimes things don't change.
And then this was on Sunday. Sunday morning, the rest of us were cooling out because we were all there to help earn, our keep. Ted was off with his boys on some street corner, stuff like that. And then, see, I guess what I say in the top here would be something I think we talked about. Boston, Mississippi, and North Carolina communities, and practice of community organization and health improvement. What ways does established theory and practice inform practice in the black community? And how does prior history of race matter? Okay. And Ted and I were both influenced by social work and community organization theory. But it didn't fit the needs of the African American community as well as it did other populations. The other populations were white, but they were also immigrant for the most part. And I say some of the things that might have influenced practice in Boston, Mississippi, in North Carolina would be historical, like the slave experience, Reconstruction, racial segregation, economic oppression, and theories supportive of racial separation. And I think we're still dealing with those issues in one way or another, and oftentimes have not confronted it directly. Now, we were both hired by an organization that believed in remediation, social work, settlement houses, health promotion, family values, and all that stuff. Ted in Boston, youth worker, values reorientation, health and leisure time in a healthy location. Stay out of jail, get an education was what he preached. Jail time for brown men, organization and education for selected inmates. And I was a South End Planning Council, that was my organization. And I can remember one of the programs I was proudest of was getting the Technical Institute to train local men how to fix plumbing, do simple electrical work, decorate the houses, change locks, do stuff like that, so they could more competently keep up the properties that they had acquired. And then, I start off in Mississippi. The great liberator sort of missed it, Lincoln. What really freed the black folk in Mississippi was the cotton picking machine. And then about 1950 something, they had developed a machine that could replace 100 people. Because a human picker on the average, pick about 200 bales a day, and that machine could pick over 100. Well, at any rate, when I went into Mississippi, I didn't have anything in writing about organizing farmer sharecroppers and tenant workers. And the kind of undercurrent was, does this stuff work with poor, uneducated black folk in Mississippi? And I hired a local preacher to sort of guide me around, Reverend Ward.
Who was that?
Reverend Ward was a local preacher in Mount Bio, Mississippi. He was used to going in and preaching on the plantation and then stopping by the big house to pick up his check. I remember the first time I went on one of the big plantations over by the river. And there were a couple of, civil rights stuff was going on. And there were a couple of men who looked like they could have been part-time clanners standing at the gate. One had a shotgun, the other one had 2 guns on his hips. And the Reverend sped by, waved at them, and there was a sign there saying, "Trespassers will be shot." And I said, "Reverend, you saw that sign?" He said, "Oh yeah, they don't mean us. We're doing God's work." I said, I'm just so happy I'm doing God's work, because I thought those boys were going to blow us away. And of course, what I found out was that Reverend Ward knew all these plantations, a lot of the people. He knew who the leaders were. And he was a big man in the Knights and Daughters of Tabor, which was the main burial society for the Delta of Mississippi. And they had organized so that everybody on the plantation could have an affordable burial. And I don't know, they might have been paying 25 cents a month into that plan. So much of the structured organizational life of the Delta was really about the church system and making sure you got a good burial. Well, when I talked to my mother and grandfather, in Kentucky, theirs was the Kentucky Benevolent Society. And Uncle Dan was a big man in the Kentucky Burial Society. That was my mother's uncle. Now, in Boston, I was working with Irish, Polish people and so forth, and my job was to let them know what wonderful health services we had. And finally they said, well, we want to be healthy, but we really want to be put away nice. And that's what I wish you'd kind of work on. That was South Boston. And then over time, I began to realize when I traveled to other nations or other parts of the country, what old people were primarily concerned about was to be put away nice, to have a nice burial, and to make sure that the relatives and everybody was there and they had a good preacher. And if they had those things going, they could deal with passing on. Well, anyway, that's some of the things that I remember off the top. And I believe we could get some theory out of this, Vic. Like, how do you interact with lower income traditional communities that happen to be black and have lived through varying stages of segregation in the United States, and where there's high levels of superstition and fear of cops and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. It all sounds fine to me.
Well, Ted hadn't had his say.
I heard that. That was on my mind. When do you want to, I am recording this, but I'm wondering when you want to start, you know, like a segment. So for example, I thought we might start with a little biographical information. Just, you know, a few minutes about where you were born, how you came to where you got, just a few minutes to situate it, context. And then whatever topics you want to take on, Boston, Mississippi, Chapel Hill.
Well, of course, John is older than I am. So I watched him do his thing as a community organizer. Well, he seemed to have been working with older people. And what I saw when going to Boston was the Crusaders, which is a group of young boys, they called themselves a club, had been charged with murdering a white priest. And the authorities were wanting to breathe down their throats to get them if they dropped chewing gum on the sidewalk. So I took those young men